Another winter meetings has come and gone, and Mets fans are left asking the same exact question that they always have been. What exactly is the plan? Edwin Díaz is gone. Pete Alonso is also gone. Jorge Polanco is now in. And across Queens, the reaction is swung from confusion to frustration to full-blown panic. That's what it is right now. So this week, we're going to try to answer the only question that matters right now to Mets fans. Where do the Mets go from here? And we've got a couple of guests this week to help answer the questions that every Mets fan is asking right now. So let's get right to it. This is Straight Outta Flushing. Okay, so we need a serious breakdown of what I would say is the roughest, or at least one of the roughest weeks in Mets franchise history. It's a week where we saw Edwin Díaz leave. We saw Pete Alonso. Both of them walk straight out of Flushing. Yes, I decided to use that there. So to break this all down, joining me is somebody who is well-versed in the highs and the lows of this team and Mets fandom. His name is Andrew Claudio. He is the co-host of the Just Mets podcast, and he joins me now. Andrew, after a rough week, how you doing, man?
I'm managing, Dexter. I think time heals, and some context and some rational thought also helps. Understanding that the offseason didn't end this week, just the tenure of two beloved Mets did end. So I'm doing well. How are you on those fronts?
I'm doing okay. I felt a little better for people who missed it. I was a guest on the Just Mets podcast just a few days ago, and Andrew and I talked through some things then, and we're going to try to talk through some things now. So I'm doing okay. I'm still trying to process, still trying to make sense of some things. I feel like you're going to be able to help me too. So hopefully we
I
can
hope
do that.
I'll just say this: the dark places I had gone to the other day, I've come out. I'm out the other side.
You've come out the dark places. Okay.
I'm able to see the light if there is one.
Okay, good. You're not taking any more darkness retreats. You're in the
light.
Okay.
No. I'm now not worried that Soto's opt out in 5 years will be David Stearns' get out of jail free card. That he will just look at that as like, oh, fine, opt out, please. I don't want another 10 years on your contract anyway. I'm back to somewhat rational thought now.
Okay. All right. So since we're back to rational thought, and I think for this segment of the episode, we should try to employ some rational thought here. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to try to have a discussion rationally about what has happened and then also where the Mets can go from here, right? So, Andrew, I guess from your perspective, when you've thought about this, you've had a couple of days to sit with this now, what does it mean when a franchise lets two of their cornerstone players who are extremely popular with the fan base walk during the same winter meetings? Because that is what happened here with the Mets. What does that mean for the Mets, the fans, their fan base? What does it all mean?
So I do think they were a victim of timing just being awful. That it does appear that they did want to bring Diaz back, and then Alonso got the offer that he did the day after they lost Edwin Díaz. So it happening in back-to-back days in the span of almost identical time of day too, like bam, it happens on Wednesday, bam, it happens on Tuesday. I don't think they planned it that way for them to lose both Diaz and Alonso in back-to-back days, but I think for me, in the readjustment of expectations about this offseason, it's really that this is now David Stearns' team. The keys have been completely surrendered over to him. There are no sacred cows, no matter how long you've been with the organization, no matter what moments you've had for the organization, no matter how high your jersey sales are. He's going to build this team however he wants it, and in the vision that he believes will be the best for the team going forward. And I think that's up to every Mets fan to decide whether that's a good or a bad thing. But make no mistake, the future of this team will now be put together by David Stearns and how he wants it to be.
Yeah, and we'll get to more of this a little bit later in the Steve Cohen-ness of it all too. And obviously you want your ownership. I think fans want their owners to let the people that, whether it's any sport, basketball, baseball, football, whatever it may be, let those people do those things. But I want to go back to Pete for a second, because there were multiple reports that the Mets never gave Pete or made him a formal offer. How do you interpret that? Was it, philosophical, financial, or simply a little bit of what you just alluded to in the last question, that this is just Stearns looking at his evaluation, Pete Alonso does not fit the way he wants to build this team. Is it simply just that? Is it money? What did you make of all that with the Mets not giving him an offer?
Bit of a cop out here for my answer here, Dex. It's all three. It's a philosophical,
which is true. It can be that. It can be that.
It's a philosophical evaluation of where he was willing to go financially. I think we could have said this last year that he did not want to bring Pete Alonso back at a certain number, and that was off a bad year. And then off a good year, when the market was a little more robust for Pete Alonso, he clearly had an evaluation that he was not willing to go outside of. And if it wasn't for him waiting out the market last year for it to be possible for Pete to come back on a 1-year deal where he was able to get him on the contract that made him more comfortable. And I think this, to your first question, also goes back to the no sacred cows thing. This wasn't Pete Alonso, Mets cornerstone, guy that hit the home run against Milwaukee, fan favorite, all-time franchise home run leader. This was, in his evaluation, a defensively challenged first baseman that his game is predicated on power, and power usually goes away in your 30s. And he was not willing to give that evaluation, the evaluation of that player, a 5-year deal. And I think that's a fair evaluation, to be honest, even though, again, the payroll restrictions that I think are a bit self-imposed bother me a little bit, but on it in a vacuum and on its face, I can at least understand the evaluation being what it is, even if I think Pete Alonso is a little more valuable than just what he is or isn't defensively. So I look at it as it's all the above, a philosophical thing he believes in that allowed him to let Pete Alonso go to a place financially in the market that he wasn't willing to go to.
And it's fair, and I think you and I would both agree that Pete Alonso was limited in certain aspects as a player, so I can understand that evaluation. And I'll get more into this later in the episode, but fans are on the other side going to say, well, he meant something to us. He meant something more to this organization. He is the team's all-time leader in home runs and all that stuff. On one hand, I kind of respect Stearns for not necessarily having the sentimentality here and doing what he necessarily will think is best. I think there's got to be a balance with that, but we'll get into that a little bit later. So when you come back to Stearns, right? And I thought about limiting this to this year in 2025 and looking at the last 6 months and going back to the trade deadline and all that. But if you really even go back to last offseason, if we really take that whole evaluation too, right? He's had a lot of restraint. That's the word I will use to be sort of nice here, right? He's had a lot of restraint, right? What does that tell you about his long-term roster building plan that he's got is it restraint or is it another R word that I've been using in these conversations? Is it rigidity? How do you like to look at this?
So I think restraint is the word. The Athletic used the word the Mets will be disciplined in their approach this offseason. And look, 5 words I just haven't said a lot over the past 7 days. To give David Stearns credit, he does have a track record of building the infrastructure of organizations. It's what he did with Milwaukee. It's what he did in a lesser role in Houston. And it's what he's done with the Mets so far in helping build out their farm system. It's why it's so highly regarded, even though he's only been here for 2 years. What he's been doing level by level within the farm system is building good habits. Like you're seeing 3rd and 4th round picks now being highly regarded within the organization. What that means from a free agency standpoint, I actually don't think you need to just stop at last year, Dexter. During his time in Milwaukee, combining it with the Mets, he has given out a contract more than 3 years in his entire tenure. Only 4 times. 2 of those were extensions to Freddie Peralta and Christian Yelich. One was a signing of Lorenzo Cain. And one was Juan Soto that I think you and I both agree Steve Cohen had much more to do with that than David Stearns did. So, look, I do think he is really good at establishing the infrastructure of an organization. You know, I come from the basketball world. What I always appreciated about Tom Thibodeau was his rigidity, which is why I think it's a fascinating comparison, but the floor that he established with the Knicks. And like they might not be as high as you want them to be, but they definitely won't go any lower than a place that they haven't been for the majority of this century. And like I always appreciated the floor that Tom Thibodeau established with the Knicks, even though they eventually decided they needed to explore a different ceiling. With David Stearns, he's now in charge of a franchise that's made the playoffs in back-to-back years exactly twice in their franchise history. I will understand if he's able to build a Brewers-like floor with the Mets, and Steve Cohen calls that a success. I do think there will come a time that he has to turn the Mets from a playoff contender into a championship contender, which will force him to go out of his comfort zone financially. But for now, I want to give him at least that benefit of the doubt that he's trying to establish a floor with his rigidity and with his discipline. And we'll see if it eventually leads to sustained success for a franchise that hasn't always been able to say they've had that.
See, you're being very, I think, rational and logical here, and you're trying. And I think some Mets fans are going to hear that and say, no. Forget that. You said you wanted to be the Dodgers. You wanted to be the Dodgers East. We're trying to win championships now. The Dodgers went better. Edwin Díaz just joined the Dodgers. And I want to say, I understand that emotion. I do. I really do understand that emotion here. And I'm going to put a pin in what you just said there because I thought it was really good. But I want to take that to Edwin Díaz now because we just talked about Pete. How should fans interpret the decision to let Edwin Díaz leave? And I think you and I, we talked about this on your show. I thought Díaz was the more important of the two between him and Pete Alonso to bring back. I really felt that way going into the season. I know there are others who felt that way too. But when you look at the decision to let Edwin Díaz leave, and I use the word decision there very strongly because it felt like they could have had him if they wanted to. It at least appears that way, right, from all the reporting and everything. So when I look at that, my question here is, Andrew, was it simply risk management and not wanting to pay him the amount that he wanted because he got less years than we thought? A lot of people thought he was going to get 5 years. He did not get that from the Dodgers, right? So you didn't have to worry about maybe the back end of that contract looking as bad as you thought it might have. So was it simply risk management based on the contract type, or is it just a signal that Stearns does not value the closer position in the same way that the prior regime before him did? How do you view Díaz walking away? How should fans view it? I guess rationally. We use that word again. How should fans view this rationally? That's my question.
I got to be honest, this isn't the one to be rational about because if it was like Pete Alonso, just a philosophical difference of evaluation where I evaluate him or you evaluate him higher or differently than David Stearns, we can just agree to disagree on the evaluation.
Right.
I think they valued Díaz to a certain level. I think they wanted to bring him back. I think they wanted to pay him more. I think they were willing to go to a fourth year and give him what they want. I think you can actually blame him and criticize him for how he handled the negotiations. You walked in with a lowball offer that was just $15 million more than the failed closer of the Yankees that you just signed. And look, they didn't owe Díaz a phone call. I actually don't blame the Mets for not calling him and saying we're signing Devin Williams. But when Díaz sees that and the offer you've given me is just $15 million more after what I've been able to establish in the closer position for your franchise, I'm going to be a little offended. And when the World Series champs of back-to-back years are now available and now looking for a closer and are now looking to me to be the new closer for their team, they're a more attractive destination, Dexter. And we talked about this on Just Mets the other day. When you're dating someone, when you're courting someone, you want to take them to the nicest restaurants. You want to do favors for them. You want to clean and cook and do things to show you matter to me. And I want to commit to you long term. You will not have any doubt in your mind where my commitments are, where you stand on the priority chart. The Baltimore Orioles did that for Pete Alonso. They didn't have to go to 4 years for Pete. And then they went 5 to Pete. Apparently Pete Alonso's market was the Mets for probably $1. The Boston Red Sox and Cubs, it's been reported that they were willing to go for 3 years. And look, maybe the Mets were willing to do a similar 1+1 or maybe a 2 to 3 year deal. But then the Orioles saw that and said, here's 5 years, Pete. We want you. And Pete clearly read that by how they prioritized him. If the Mets wanted Edwin Díaz, I'm confident they would have Edwin Díaz. They went in with a certain offer that allowed a more attractive suitor to enter the negotiations. I don't blame Edwin Díaz for seeing where the Mets were last year compared to the Dodgers were last year and seeing the offers being that close and deciding to go to a much better situation.
Oh, yeah. I think I agree with you. This is the one you don't have to be rational on, but if you're going to be rational about it in the way you just said, you can't really be mad at Edwin Díaz for choosing the Dodgers, right? And I will use the same analogy that I used on your show. I agree with you on the wine and dining. When you want to court somebody, you got to let them know what time it is. You can't be taking them to Applebee's.
Nope.
And David Stearns came with the Applebee's offer. And Edwin Díaz was like, I'm better than Applebee's. And he's right. he's absolutely right here. And
it's almost like he's saying, go enjoy your Applebee's closer at this point. You know, no disrespect to Devin Williams, but to your point, if they wanted Edwin Díaz, they would have given him a 4 seasons offer right away.
Facts.
They would have made it clear, this is how we value you. And to what we've been talking about, I think there was a comfort level that David Stearns was willing to negotiate with. And he didn't go outside it initially. Maybe he was prepared to go to it after negotiations, but got caught with his pants down a little bit and saw that the Dodgers entered negotiations, and now he's a Dodger.
Now he is a Dodger. Mets fans, if you're upset about that, I completely understand why. Now,
and real quick,
please,
to Mets fans that are upset about this, because I don't want to sound like just the only rational person like that. I'm just trying to talk rationally here. I walked into my wedding reception to Narcos. Like, the Edwin Díaz walk-up means something to me personally. I was so annoyed on Tuesday. I blame Stearns for it. This isn't like a try to rationalize that Díaz left because he didn't want to be here. Why didn't he want to be here? That's the question we now needed to ask.
Yep.
Of why the Mets, with their payroll capabilities, but now payroll restrictions that seem to exist, lost the best closer in baseball.
Yeah, and I'll tell you what, and we'll have more time to get into this down the road, but if, Devin Williams is out there looking like no shade to Devin Williams, an Applebee's level closer this season, City Field's not going to be happy. That's all I'm saying.
I think
they're not going to be happy.
That's more offensive to Applebee's than it is to Devin Williams.
Yikes.
Applebee's got me through some very broke portions of my life. So
Yikes.
I will value the eating good in the neighborhood more than I will someone that can't close games in the night.
Yeah,
I think Devin Williams will bounce back this year. He's going to have to do it in a way that makes me forget that the Mets jumbled negotiations with Edwin Díaz.
It's fair. That's fair. Very interesting. You valued eating good in the neighborhood. It seemed like the Mets did value Edwin Díaz, but that's a whole nother thing. Now, you look, with all this stuff happening, Andrew, it was at some point you have to move forward. And on Saturday, the Mets moved forward a little bit as they signed former Seattle Mariner Jorge Polanco. And a lot of places you saw a lot of journalists, even my colleagues Joel Sherman, John Heyman, they described this as a solid signing. You've seen this across several reports. How do you look at Jorge Polanco as fitting into a roster that just lost Pete Alonso? And how much, if any, does he move the needle? I want to be very clear. He is an infielder / DH. He's only played 1 game in his career at first base. So I'm not sure he is the Pete Alonso replacement. He could be, but how does he fit into this roster, and does he move the needle at all, Andrew?
So my initial reaction in the moment, whether it be what, again, your colleague John Heyman reported and what Jeff Passan at ESPN reported, that this is someone who's going to play first and DH. A bit curious that so much was made about Pete Alonso's defense and run prevention, yet the replacement for him is going to be someone that's played, I mean, you said 1 game. Not only did he only play 1 inning, he's played 1 batter in his major league career. He was an injury replacement for 1 batter at first base in San Francisco last year. We're talking about someone that's played at first base in the major leagues for one more batter than you and I have in his 12-year career. This is not a replacement for Pete Alonso. I don't think anybody can actually spin this as a replacement for Pete. He did have a very good year at the plate, OPS over 800, OPS plus over 130. I don't really look at the RBI numbers because I think anybody that now has Juan Soto hitting in front of them, their numbers will just start to go up because the run scoring opportunities will be there. He doesn't have the power capabilities to replace a Pete Alonso at first, and he's just never played first base. So I can't look at this as the first base replacement. What I can look at this as is an upgrade over the Jesse Winker, Starling Marte platoon. And I hate to say it also might mean something for Mark Vientos. We'll see what his market starts to dictate. Maybe Mark Vientos is now going to be your first baseman if the Mets do want to try and bring him back. We'll see what the trade market looks like with Brett Beatty. If they decide to move Brett in a trade, then Polanco could spend some time at third base instead, having experience already playing the other two, that position, and more specifically the other two infield positions. It's absolutely an upgrade, especially with the dreadful season they got from the DH position last year. A solid hitter to the team for a 2-year deal. In a vacuum, it's fine. It's what I've basically landed on. It's fine. It's not your full off season. You're not done, but it is a step toward moving forward, as you said. And I think if I'm just looking at it as a DH upgrade, which is, he's basically split his time with the Mariners at DH and second base last year. It is an upgrade over what they used to have. So I'm okay with it.
Yeah, and 2 years, I didn't mention the money, 2 years, $40 million. So 20 per there to upgrade a DH. I'm with you. I think it's fine. I also agree you can't be looking at this as a Pete Alonso replacement, but that goes to where I would like to go next. Because with Alonso gone, and at least right now on the roster, no obvious big bat to replace him, what do you think the Mets' realistic paths, logical, rational paths are to add an impact bat here on offense with some power? I don't know if you can replace all the power that Pete Alonso has now taken with him to Baltimore, but can you replace at least some of it? And what do you think are some realistic options towards doing so?
Great question, Dexter, because I don't know that there is replacing Pete Alonso's power. I guess it's time to quote what is probably David Stearns' favorite movie, Moneyball. You don't replace Jason Giambi with one player, right? You got to replace him in the aggregate with multiple players. And with these self-imposed payroll restrictions that probably take them out of Kyle Tucker or Alex Bregman or Cody Bellinger or some of the other high-profile bats that are on the market, you're going to have to look in different places to replace Pete Alonso. Now, that could mean like trading for Wilson Contreras, Ramon Liriano out in San Diego. It could just mean Mark Vientos playing better and hitting better this season. It could mean Brett Beatty taking a step he hit close to 20 home runs last year. Maybe this is a step towards 25. Maybe Ryan Clifford, all of 22 years old, comes up and takes over at first base and shows that he's got similar if worse, but still adequate power numbers at the major league level. This is where Carson Bench has an important role next season. And you start to look at other places to collectively replace Pete Alonso's power throughout the lineup. It's going to take a village to replace Pete Alonso offensively. And I guess we'll have to wait and see if David Stearns is able to do that.
None of that sounds encouraging.
I know, not very enticing, but that's where I think we are at the moment. Replacing him in the aggregate,
Yeah, nobody wants to hear that, but it's very likely what it's going to be. Let's go to pitching real quick here, because there's been several reports that have indicated that, and I think you would agree, and you and I have talked about this before. The Mets need a top end starter. They need that. And there's been talk about will they sign an ace, will they trade for an ace, but the way Stearns appears to be operating, I'm going to be careful and use the word appears. There seems to be hesitation on these deals and giving out length, right? And you talked about the amount of over 3-year deals that he's given out in his tenure running baseball teams. So how does the Mets thread that needle? Like, you need a top tier starter, but you're not necessarily willing to give out long-term contracts. Players want long-term contracts for the security, obviously. Do you believe that a trade is more likely for the Mets than maybe a long-term free agent contract? What do you think is more likely for the Mets to land a top-tier starter, which they absolutely need?
I too would like them to address the actual reason why their team and their season fell apart last year in the starting pitching.
You want the
I will
truth,
say,
Andrew? You want the truth
I,
to be put out there?
I I'm just saying, like, if it appears that Pete Alonso's defense had nothing to do with Frankie Montas and Sean Manaea and Paul Blackburn and Kodai Senga and David Peterson all not being able to get out of third and fourth innings last year. Look, again, those 5 words I haven't, to give David Stearns credit, there really hasn't been much activity on the free agent market for pitching. It's still in Cease and Merrill Kelly. That's the only big names that have signed somewhere. Now, look, Merrill Kelly fits the David Stearns payroll restrictions that I'm talking about, and it's a 2-year deal. So maybe he just wasn't in their evaluation. Maybe he just wanted to go back to Arizona. But like, they were never going to give Dylan Cease 7 years. They're not going to give Framber Valdez 7 years. They're not going to give Ranger Suarez 7 years. And those last two, I don't want them to give 7 years to either of them. So I think you're right. It's going to probably be in the pitching, in the trade market. I think they could be opportunistic, whether it's like a Zach Gallen or a Michael King, although I know the Boston Globe just reported that Michael King is probably I would, just to make a prediction, I think he'll end up with the Red Sox. Boston native, went to Boston College, or Rhode Island native, I should say, went to Boston College. And so I think he ends up there. But like a 2 to 3 year deal, similar to what the Manaea, Montas, Clay Holmes offseason was last year, would be something that they look to do if it's in free agency. And in the trade market, look, it's probably more appetizing to look there. The Athletics report of the Mets-Padres trade negotiations is enticing, whether it's Nick Pivetta or you go, obviously the Tariq Skubal and Joe Ryan and Freddie Peralta aces that are out there are also, front and center. And I hope they'll be in on all of them. It's probably going to be a trade. This is also where you got to go to the infrastructure. We did see the Nolan McLean, Jonah Tong, Brandon Sproat call-ups last year. One of them giving you what appears to be already a front-of-the-line rotation option. So maybe he's just trying to keep the books open a bit, or more specifically, some spots open a bit. Because where I think we're going next is there are still guys here that are blocking paths to add new additions to the roster in the pitching department.
Yeah, that's exactly where we're going next. And those guys you're talking about, David Peterson, Kodai Senga, their names, they both have come up in possible discussions in terms of trades. And I just think even the fact their names are coming up makes me ask this: how do you read where the Mets value their internal pitching options right now that are on the roster right now? How do you think they value those guys like Peterson and Senga?
I think if they could find a trade partner for Senga, they absolutely would. We've seen it reported the last couple of days, the need trades that the Mets may be looking to do. I think Kodai Senga, the ceiling is very high, the floor is very low, and as we've talked about, David Stearns is trying to establish some high floors with the people that he puts on the roster. So I think if you could find a partner there, they'd absolutely look to find one. The David Peterson stuff is interesting because up until like 6 weeks left in the season, I was very comfortable with David Peterson as a quality part of the rotation, to the point where I was wondering if they should discuss extension with David Peterson, and then whether he got hurt or just hit an innings cap on a place he's never gone to at a major league level. He just was dreadful in September, and it's part of the reason why they collapsed. But again, there was a portion of last year where nobody was going 6 innings except David Peterson. So I'm very curious to see, just because of how valuable left-handed pitching is on the market, if the mentioning of him in trade rumors, in trade speculation, is just to see what his market is, to see if somebody is willing to give you like a valuable piece that you like. Obviously they're going to need another reliever, so maybe it's a big we just talked about San Diego. They've got a great bullpen. Maybe they want to give you one of their key arms that's available for a David Peterson. Houston has Brian Abreu, who is one of the best relievers in baseball. Like, maybe you trade him for David Peterson. They're both on 1-year deals, and it's a need for both teams. So I wonder if that's more the opportunistic thing with Peterson. Fact of the matter is we're talking about what they might do in the pitching department and moves they might make and guys they might add and guys they might trade for. The roster's currently full. Like, as of right now, everybody from last year's rotation is currently still on the roster except for Frankie Montas. So work is still there to be done for Mr. Stearns.
Now their work is still there to be done. All right, two more things real quick for you here. We talked earlier about being rational and all that, and some people may say it's overrated right now. But do you believe the frustration that we've seen this week from the fan base is justified, or is this more of a case of fans reacting before the offseason is complete? Do you think the outrage, if you want to say that, or frustration that we've seen from the fan base is justified?
So you've heard me say a few times throughout our conversation, Dex, self-imposed restrictions. You should be able to re-sign Pete Alonso and bring back Edwin Díaz for the money he originally wanted, and be smart about run prevention and other like floor establishing moves when Steve Cohen is your owner. This last week, for me, and I think for a large portion of the fan base, it's been a readjustment of expectations. Now, that may end up being a good thing, that they adjusted and pivoted to more David Stearns philosophical moves and processes. We may also be sitting here a month from now awaiting a Kyle Tucker, Tariq Skubal press conference. Like, it could just be that it's December and there's plenty of offseason left. But in the moment, I have now established a new line that the Mets aren't willing to go to in the offseason and in their team building, and that's been an adjustment for me, especially after a few years under Steve Cohen of me thinking that line doesn't exist. So that's how I've processed the last week, and that's how I think the fan base has either rationally, irrationally, or more specifically, emotionally had to process this last week. I know that's definitely the three different emotions I've felt over the last week for sure.
Yeah, there's been a roller coaster of emotions. I guess last thing for me here, Andrew, if the Mets are going to shift the narrative, you just kind of alluded to that, things could change in a month. You could be sitting at a press conference bringing in two high-profile players, and it's much different. If you had to choose one move, what's the one move that you think would immediately change the tone of this offseason? Because right now, wherever you want to put it, it's not here, and I'm putting my hands up high for people listening to audio. It's much lower. It's very low vibes in terms for the Mets fan. But what's one move that you think would change the whole tone and people are like, hey, back on the Mets bandwagon, feeling good about Stearns again? What's that one move?
So I tried to keep it realistic because, again, I do the self-imposed restrictions that we've discussed throughout the convo today. I think going to Boston and getting Jarren Duran would be one. I think the Brewers have been a fascinating trade conversation to have because I don't think they had the best record in the National League last year. I don't think they should be a team that's looking to trade really anybody of value on that roster. They should be looking to add and try to get better. But a couple weeks ago, Will Salmon put out that like a Freddie Peralta, Trevor McGill, Tyler's brother combo, that could be something that could be available. So if the Mets were to go out there and get both Trevor McGill and Freddie Peralta and or Jarren Duran from the Red Sox, I mean, those are three quality baseball players that would suddenly help your run prevention issue, be good offensively from Duran's part. That's an ace that you can pair with Nolan McLean with Duran, and that's a bullpen piece that you could pair with Devin Williams. I said this to you the other day. You're literally just recreating the 2024 Brewers, which won 93 games, and if Pete Alonso doesn't have one of the biggest home runs in Mets history, they're in the NLDS, maybe the NLCS if they beat the Phillies. I do think that it's going to be a move like that, a trade for multiple pieces that upgrade significant needs for this team or fill significant holes for this team. I will be pleasantly surprised if it's a Kyle Tucker or a Cody Bellinger or a Tariq Skubal or something more aggressive that forces David Stearns to go out of his comfort zone.
I think you're being reasonable and rational, as we try to be throughout this conversation. Those are moves that would change the tone. I agree. But some people are going to say, Andrew, this ain't Milwaukee, bro. And I
I,
understand that to
I
some
don't
degree.
disagree with any of those
Don't
people,
disagree
by
with
the
any of that.
way.
But this is where we are with the, as you said, the self-imposed restrictions, and we'll see how all of that plays out. But this was a way with my guy Andrew Claudio, co-host of the Just Mets podcast, to try to talk rationally about what happened with the Mets and where they go next. Let us know what you think in the comments. Are we being rational? Are we not? Are we, should we be angrier? I don't like to live in a space of anger. That's just not what I choose to do. But if you're angry, we understand. We hope that we were able to bring you some calm and some good feelings about it. Andrew, I always appreciate you coming on Straight Out of Flushing. The great job that you and Rich do with Just Mets podcast. Keep up the great work. I will talk to you soon, my friend.
Yes, sir. Thank you, Dexter.
Now, after a week like this, the roster has been shaken up, but so is the fan base. They're feeling really shaken right now. That's why I'm going to bring in somebody who speaks directly to the heart of Mets fandom. Her name is Ashley Wenskoski. She's the co-host of the Why My Mets Fan podcast, and she joins me now. Ashley, how are you doing?
Thanks so much for having me on again, Dexter. Very happy to join you. I feel like there's no other week where I'm more apt to get some things out about the Mets, and I know a lot of fans feel that way as well.
Oh yeah. I wanted to talk about it from the fan side because there's been a lot of, frustration. There's been skepticism. There's been angst. There's a whole emotional fallout from this that I think, we have to talk about and then we're going to try to figure out what's the bigger picture here that is at play for the Mets. So let me ask you this for yourself and talking to other Mets fans, what's been the vibe among the fan base after losing Edwin Diaz, after losing Pete Alonso all in the same week during the winter meetings? What's the vibe like right now?
I mean, I don't think you can describe it any other way besides bad. The vibe amongst Mets fans right now is not good. I believe it was Steve Gelbs of SNY who said earlier this week that he has not seen Mets fans so upset, at least in recent memory, as they were this week. And that's really saying something when you consider missing the playoffs last year, the trials and tribulations that this fan base has been through. I think that people are upset this week. They're confused, and I don't necessarily really, blame them for that. I think this fallout from the winter meetings that we're discussing would be an entirely different story if we had sort of begun to see parts of David Stearns' vision be executed with a couple of signings. But really, aside from Jorge Polanco a couple of days ago, we haven't. And I think it's a bigger issue than just losing guys that have some star power in Alonso and Diaz and Nimmo in a sense, right? It's the end of an era. These were guys that were, for some Mets that a whole new generation grew up on. For some people like myself, it's a new generation of young adults that really deepened their Mets fandom through these guys for the last 7, 8 years. So I think it encapsulates a lot of emotions. It's, kind of watching those memories of last year's NLCS run and some other big moments, walk out the door and walk to rivals in some senses. And I think it goes beyond the emotion of things too. It's stings for fans because these guys were long tenured Mets. They were likable. They were really a part of the culture in New York, but they were also at the top of the sport in points. I mean, Pete Alonso wins the home run derby twice. Edwin Diaz, the whole trumpets entrance and being, the dominant season in 2022. This isn't just an emotional attachment to these players, and I think that's important to separate as well. These are guys that are the best in the game at certain points and did that in a Mets uniform at certain points. But the flip side of that coin, as Terry Collins himself said earlier this week, is that as much as we loved this core, as much as we wanted to see them succeed, they didn't really do that, right? They haven't really won anything. And I think from that perspective, I don't necessarily dispute that it was time to shake things up.
Okay, so you do think it was time to shake things up, and it can be fine to have that perspective, and also still, miss these guys that fans have grown attached to, and that's one thing about the vibes about everything that's happened this week. But I guess also from you doing your pod, you and Sam doing your pod, and then you have to talk about the front office. So what are the vibes about the Mets front office right now. Do Mets fans actually believe that David Stearns and company, they have a clear and coherent plan? Because I think it's fair to question right now, what is the plan?
Well, right. David Stearns said at the end of this season, at the end of 2025, that he wanted the Mets to get more athletic and he wanted to have an increased focus on, defense, run prevention. He's operating in a really cold and calculating manner, I think, by settling for losing guys that were, bona fide stars, bona fide great Mets. And I think the problem this week for fans has been, to some extent, his vision is still elusive. He said those things, getting more athletic, focusing more on defense, but you haven't really seen that fully come to fruition yet, right? They're not necessarily getting younger with the addition of Semien or Polanco. Semien does help you out on defense. That sort of felt like a one-for-one trade. Brandon Nimmo, you trade a bat for Semien's glove in a sense. But I guess we just don't know, and we haven't seen him put all of the pieces together yet. I think the noise would be a lot quieter right now if they had done a few more signings at the winter meetings, if you had sort of started to see things, shape up. I think that David Stearns right now is trading some of that star power and what comes with it, contracts that he's not comfortable giving out, either money or lengthwise, for some, gritty, more grinder type of guys, for some more depth in the lineup. And I think you're going to see the young guys start to play plenty as well. So while I hesitate to say that fans don't believe in the vision right now, I think they're just having a hard time picturing it. And I think it's going to take, seeing it shape up and even seeing some proof into next season that it can work for fans to really buy in.
So when I heard you say that, and even the last part of what you just said about fans having a hard time envisioning it, right? Ashley, I think so much of that has to do with Steve Cohen, because they look at the ownership and, Steve Cohen now owning this team, has got a lot of money. It's not my money or your money, but a lot of money to spend, right? And so they expect, maybe the expectations was the team's going to look a certain way. It's going to look like the Dodgers. They're going to be aggressive. They're going to go get free agents and things of that nature. Do you think this winter meetings, and I'll call it a fallout, has impacted how fans view Steve Cohen's stewardship right now and the promises that he made early in his ownership about trying to be the Dodgers East and having the sustainable winning? Do you think they're looking at Steve Cohen a little bit differently right now?
I think the unfortunate reality is that I think some of the shine around Steve Cohen is starting to wear off a little bit. And I think
Mm.
that much of the vision, so to speak, for building the team is rooted in David Stearns and his philosophies. But there's no disputing, there's no world where David Stearns is making these decisions without the blessings of the Cohens. This is still rooted in the Cohens. So, fans are very quick to bring up, and I don't blame them, how in 2020, when Steve Cohen bought the Mets, he promised Mets fans a World Series in 3 to 5 years. And in those 5 years, they've missed the playoffs 3 times. They had one quick exit in the wild card round, and they did have one run to the NLCS. And now, on top of all that, this offseason, they don't appear to be operating with much urgency, to be honest with you. So I think what you're seeing from fans is they're really starting to, I guess, maybe question the communication style of the front office. I think the most alarming thing to me personally, out of everything that has come out these past few weeks in Mets world, is really the lack of communication or maybe even respect from the outgoing players. Last year, the entire offseason narrative surrounding signing Juan Soto was Steve and Alex Cohen and, their family style atmosphere and how much players wanted to play for the Mets and just really that palpable culture shift, which was so stark coming out of the Wilpon era. Now this offseason, in the last week alone, you're hearing Pete Alonso say that he found the transparency from the Orioles refreshing. You're hearing Edwin Díaz say that he wanted to go play for a winning organization. You're even hearing a guy like Brandon Nimmo, the longest tenured Met on the team, say that he was taken aback to even be involved in trade discussions. So I don't think that, fans are out on Steve Cohen by any means, but I just think that people still believe in the resources that he has and, the desire that he has to be competitive, to create a winner in Queens. But I do think that maybe his shine or that family atmosphere, that they were so proud of last offseason has taken a little bit of a hit in the past few weeks.
Yeah, and that's the thing. I think a lot of Mets fans, and I even think people in the media thought with him, purchasing the team that there was going to be sort of a change in culture. And it felt to that point, you talked about the family atmosphere that was being brought up so much last offseason. It felt like that was kind of a turn. Okay, this culture is shifting with Stearns, with Cohen. And now I think with the events of the last week, and I'm not saying that it can't still shift, Ash, because it can, but it does feel like, maybe have they taken a step back? Players, when players say this, that kind of stuff that you hear from Diaz, you hear from Alonso, that's not a good look because you wonder how it impacts free agency going forward and things of that nature. And I just mentioned Alonso, and I thought bringing Diaz back. I've said this on the show on this show. I said it just now. Talking with Andrew Claudio of Just Mets podcast. I thought bringing Diaz back was more significant than bringing Alonso back just because of how elite he was at his position. But Alonso has a very significant emotional tie to the fan base, right? He's the all-time leader in home runs for the franchise. How significant in your eyes is the emotional loss of Pete Alonso for fans? And what do you think that does to the identity of Mets fandom? Because it's like, hey, there's this guy that we've been rooting for this whole time, a homegrown guy, and they didn't want him back. So how do you think this impacts the Mets and their fans seeing Pete Alonso walk out the door?
Yeah, well, to start, I completely agree with you that I felt like Diaz was a bigger loss, but
Mm,
I do feel as though Alonso is the more emotional loss,
I'd
when you
agree.
take Mets fans as a whole. This is a guy that was the face of the franchise to some extent for the past 7 seasons. Sure, Francisco Lindor in that conversation as well, but Alonso is your homegrown star, the guy who has been a Met and only a Met for his entire career, the past 7 years. This was the David Wright for some people, the Keith Hernandez for some
Mhm.
people, your homegrown power hitting star. Of course, Hernandez not homegrown, but he was likable off the field in New York. He was involved. He wanted to bring a winner to Queens. And on top of all that, on top of all the niceties, I mean, this is your all-time leading home run hitter that you just let walk to the Orioles. Top five in multiple other offensive categories as well, RBIs, total bases among them. So I think that this was absolutely a very emotional loss for fans. It was also a guy who cared so much about New York, but brought them to national prominence, more than once. Won the home run derby twice, 5-time All-Star, won the Rookie of the Year. So I think the departure of Alonso is deeper than just the on the field stuff, the off the field stuff. It's really saying goodbye to the potential that his Mets legacy had, right? Because you had 7 seasons of this bona fide homegrown power hitting star. And now you're sort of kissing goodbye the potential for the rest of his career. You think about retiring his number up in the rafters at Citi Field. You think about if he goes into Cooperstown, he could have gone in as a Met. Will he still? I think it's really rooted and tied to that legacy of him being a great Met. And I think on top of all that, the news that came out that the Mets did not even make an offer to him, that to me is what really rubbed myself and I think fans the wrong way because this was, love him or hate him. This was a guy that gave it his all in Queens for 7 seasons, was highly successful both on the field and off. And it feels as though the Mets didn't even make an effort to keep him. And I know some will dispute that and say that they did offer him the 7 years, 158 million a few seasons ago. They did what they could last offseason to bring him back on the smaller deal. But to what David Stearns said that the negotiations reached a point where they were uncomfortable in talking about Alonso, to me is just sort of absurd. You look at giving a guy like Juan Soto $765 million and you can't give Pete Alonso, 155. So I think that the loss of Alonso was deeply emotional for Mets fans, and I think that, to be honest, seeing him in a Baltimore uniform next season is certainly going to be strange.
Yeah, just even, with his introduction, both him and Diaz, it's weird. It doesn't feel right. And I would, Ash, you made a good point about, what Stern said about being uncomfortable where he was willing to go with Alonso. And I would have liked to know more about that, or why, or what was that number, and
Right.
the reports that come out that, they didn't even give him an offer. No matter what you feel about Alonso, and I do think Alonso was not a perfect player. He did have his limitations. It does feel a little bit disrespectful. Like we can agree with that. Now, so you and I both agree that Diaz was the more important player to bring back, and he obviously doesn't come back either. But I was listening to what you said with Alonso and everything and the attachment that the fans have to him as a homegrown guy. But with Diaz as a closer, not a homegrown guy, but he was a guy that brought an experience to it. Andrew Claudio just talked to me about how he came out to Timmy Trumpets at his wedding. Him seeing Diaz come out in the ninth inning to that song and just hearing those horns, it was a really dope feeling for a lot of fans. He was a beloved Met. So you have this homegrown Met, and then you have this beloved Met that you can argue is the best closer in the game. When you combine these two things, I specifically want to talk about Diaz, does that affect the fan base in a way that it's only going to sour the relationship maybe between the fans and the front office and ownership, because you had a homegrown Met and then a very beloved Met that's part of the Mets experience at Citi Field. He's gone too. So how does losing Diaz as the best closing experience impact this Met fan base?
Yeah, I mean, you talk about the experience. I think in game one next year at City Fields, fans are going to feel, I mean, if it's a
Mm,
closer situation, fans are going to feel it right away, right? No
mm,
trumpets, none of that late inning scene that they made into such an event with the way that, the SNY cameras would capture it and the light show that they started to do. And they really made it a part of the identity of coming to City Field. And now that will be no longer. But you look at the on the field stuff, and quality late inning relief is at such a premium right now in baseball. And the Mets had a guy for 7 seasons that was considered by many to be the best at it in the sport. So that's why I feel like Diaz is the more sizable loss when you look at the roster top to bottom. The Edwin Diaz experience is just that. It is an experience, right? The trumpet's entrance signifies that you are about to go on a wild ride because while we were talking about how he's great, nothing with Edwin Diaz was ever easy, right? He would load the bases and then strike out the side. He would certainly give you a few heart palpitations in between closing out tight games. But aside from maybe a couple down years, maybe 2019, maybe 2024 in some people's eyes, Mets fans had that, I guess, luxury of knowing that the ninth inning was locked down. Bona fide, dominant closer is coming out of the bullpen to kind of shore things up. And I think that that's something that, other teams in baseball search for years and years. Is Devin Williams going to be that now? Maybe. He certainly has the potential that we saw in Milwaukee to do that. But I just think that Diaz, for people, his departure rub salt in the wound because all of the things
mm.
that we've been talking about, not only does he leave, but he leaves to go to the Dodgers, and he says that it's because he wants to win. You obviously can't dispute that. The Dodgers have won the World Series back-to-back years, both of the last 2 seasons. But I think it's also an indictment from a guy who was in Queens for 7 years that he doesn't necessarily believe in the at least short-term vision for the Mets to create a winner. So, yeah, Diaz walking and just the manner in which it happened, I think, was really a knife in the heart to Mets fans.
Yeah, no, I feel the same way. It's going to be weird to not hear those trumpets at Citi Field next year, excuse me, next year. And I'll tell you what, if Devin Williams doesn't get the job done, the boos are going to sound like reverse trumpets there. Nobody's gonna like that. It's going to get bad, Ash. But when you look at the winter meetings and following everything that happened, or I guess you could all say, or didn't happen, right at the winter meetings, you then had on Saturday the Mets sort of move on, right? Their next signing is Jorge Polanco, in the aftermath of everything that happened this past week. When you look at the Jorge Polanco signing, which I think it's fine, it's a solid signing. does that feel like a consolation prize for you after everything that happened, or is this part of the steps of the larger decision about what Stearns is going to do to try to shape this team in the way that he wants to shape it?
I mean, I feel exactly the same way in terms of what you just said about the Jorge Polanco signing. It's fine. It's nothing more than fine. To
All right.
me, it doesn't really move the needle in either direction. Your
Mm,
team is not going to be, sent over the edge, so to speak. The last missing piece of your puzzle was certainly not Jorge Polanco.
right.
I don't blame fans for thinking that it was a consolation prize. At the same time, I do think it's a part of David Stearns' larger vision. I think it fits the type of player that he claims to be looking for. I mean, the time frame of the contract, 2 years, 40 million, that certainly seems to fit. I think we've seen a real hesitation from Stearns to give out lengthy contracts aside from Juan Soto. So that fits sort of what he's looking for. At the same time, an average annual value of $20 million per year for Jorge Polanco, that actually struck me. That seemed like a bit of an overpay in some senses. I don't know if you can call a 2-year contract an overpay, but $20 million average annual value, kind of a lot for Polanco. But, he does bring more flexibility to the roster. He's a switch hitter. He's a decent, to good hitter from both sides of the plate. And I think that ability to move around the infield and really play multiple positions is something that was desirable to David Stearns. Will he DH? Of course. Will he maybe even play first base at times if they don't acquire a true first baseman and they don't feel comfortable with Mark Vientos there? Maybe. So it just gives, I guess, Stearns and Mendoza some more flexibility on that roster. But I don't think anybody was particularly tantalized by Jorge Polanco after losing, Nimmo, Alonso, and Diaz within a week.
Yeah, I haven't seen anybody excited about it. Everybody's been like, yeah, it's been fine. It's a nice signing. It's cool.
Right.
I would say you brought up the average annual value for his contract of 20 million. I was a little surprised to some degree about it, Ash, but at the same time, I'm like, okay, well, hopefully it doesn't look like the Frankie Montas deal, which was, 2 for
Oh my
34, so
God.
17 per, and everybody's hoping that's not the case. Polanco's a fine hitter. I think he can help, and I think he'll be more of a DH, like you said, and he gives some versatility. Yeah, I don't. What I said this with Andrew. It's not the Pete replacement, right? Like, if you're looking at this as he's going to replace Pete Alonso at first base, I think that's a little much there to ask. But I wanted to also talk to you about expectations because I think that matters sometimes. Do you think fans entered the winter meetings with unrealistic expectations for this Mets team in the front office, or did the front office just simply undeliver here? And look, I'm not judging the whole offseason on the winter meetings, but just based on what's happened in the past week, I think everybody will say it was underwhelming, right? But
Yeah.
did the front office undeliver here, or were Mets fans just had unrealistic expectations here?
I think there's two sides to this coin. I
Mm,
by no means think that the expectations from fans were unrealistic, nor do I think they should be labeled that way. But I also think that the reality of the situation is that the expectations for this offseason were sky high. You come off of missing the playoffs on the last game of the regular season. Steve Cohen, you have the richest owner in baseball. I do think that people were prepared for a major offseason, albeit one that may have shaken up the core to some degree.
mm.
I said this on our podcast, and I'm going to say it here. There is a part of me that thinks that we did get a little spoiled last year, right? But I mean, how can you not? You get Juan Soto from the team across town, and you sign him to the biggest contract in the sport in some senses. That is major. And I think anything that the Mets do this offseason, of course, is not going to live up to that. But I do think that the front office under-delivered largely in terms of their hesitancy. This team has a lot of holes right now. You couldn't even field a team right now if you're I mean, you could with guys on the greater 40-man roster, but there's a lot of holes, right? You're looking for a first baseman. You need another outfielder. The starting rotation, I don't even know where to begin, and I don't think the Mets do either. You still need help in terms of middle, late inning relief. So to leave the winter meetings, I think, with more questions than answers was not a great strategy in terms of satisfying the fans, especially when you consider just the devastating way that the 2025 season ended.
Yeah, I think that's the thing for me, right? I don't think I'm with you 155% here. I don't think it was unrealistic for fans to have high expectations for this offseason. You guys have spoke about it. I've spoke about it on this show. The Mets needed a big offseason. They needed to go out and address some things. Still think they need to go get an ace. That's still something I think they need to do. I need to address the bullpen. There's still bullpen arms they need. Now you're trusting in Devin Williams as your closer. Now you've lost all these. This is before they've lost all the guys that you mentioned, the homegrown guys. I don't think that was unrealistic, and I don't think it's unfair for fans to have come away from the winter meetings and say, this was underwhelming. Now, there's still a lot of offseason left to go. You and I were just talking about this before we started recording. There's still a long way to go. And who knows? Andrew was telling me a month from now, 3 weeks from now, whatever, we could be sitting here and the Mets are introducing some big name player they traded for, and we'll all be like, okay, this is better. But
Absolutely.
for now, Mets fans have to have hope, Ash. They have to have some hope. You know the motto is always you got to believe. Hope is something that the fans need right now. What, just for yourself, other fans you're talking to, what are Mets fans hanging on to right now? Because it feels like nothing. I'm not sure there's something for them to hang on to, but what are Mets fans hanging on to right now in terms of hope?
Well, we're talking about expectations. And did the
Hmm.
Mets meet the expectations of the fans in the winter meetings and in the offseason so far? To some extent, not to just circle back around and put a band-aid on it, but to some extent, I do think that the reaction that fans have had to this offseason and the lack of moves is a product of Steve Cohen resetting the expectations in Queens, right? Because I think a few years ago, under the Wilpons, you wouldn't have thought twice about some of the things that would happen. So to some extent, I think Steve Cohen and David Stearns, have reset expectations to a point where they're much greater and much larger than ever before. And that's a good thing. You want your team to obviously move in that direction. To give people some hope, this is at least what I've been telling myself. You still have the richest owner in the sport who has shown a willingness to spend and has shown a willingness to make moves when he feels that things are right. And you still have two bona fide superstars in your lineup in Francisco Lindor and Juan Soto. You have a 1A and a 1B in those guys. This doesn't feel like, unless something happens in the next week and they trade Lindor or something, this doesn't feel like a complete and utter rebuild and tear down. At the same time, does it feel like the Mets are settling a little bit and getting some 1Bs when they already had 1As on the roster? Yes, and I understand how that's not a good feeling. But I just go back to, Steve Cohen and David Stearns being two guys who are lifelong Mets fans running the team. They are well aware and in touch with, I guess, the urgency that fans feel to win and to bring a winner to Queens. And I realized the other day, and I've heard some people start to talk about it, that next season, the 2026 season, is going to be the 40th anniversary of 1986, the last time the Mets brought a championship back home to New York. They're going to celebrate that all year long. That's going to be, the talk of summer games at Citi Field is that it's the 40th anniversary of 1986. I do not think that's going to be lost on Steve Cohen, David Stearns, and the Mets front office. I think that Mets fans can at least take solace in knowing these are two guys running this show that have deep rooted ties to Mets fandom and are right there with you, in terms of wanting to create a winner now. Do I know exactly what David Stearns is thinking? No. Maybe he is thinking more towards 2027. I'm not sure. But at least you can rest in the fact that that these guys understand the history of the Mets.
Yeah, that does matter. 40 years, long time. Mets fans still waiting for that next World Series title. I guess last thing for me here, Ash, if you had to distill it, what's the one thing? You talked about clarity and transparency that I think Mets fans would like to see a little bit more from David Stearns in terms of what's the plan here, right? Is it that? Is it a major move? Is it that any of those things? Would that help stabilize the mood of the Mets fan right now at this moment through the offseason? Is there something you think that can get Mets fans to being like, okay, feel good about things again? We believe again. What's that thing that needs to happen?
A part of me wants to say transparency because, like we've been talking about, I do think, Steve Cohen has maybe lost a little bit of that trust with the fan base. Definitely something that he can earn back throughout the rest of this offseason and the years moving forward. All we've really heard from Cohen is, I believe he texted John Heyman, and the Post was reporting on,
Yep.
he said, I totally understand the fans' reaction. There's lots of offseason left, basically, and we have a lot of time to put a playoff team, on the field. That's really all we've heard from Steve Cohen so far. David Stearns was taking questions at the winter meetings, but did not, I believe, towards the last day or two of them. So it's sort of been radio silence. That leaves people in a place of wondering what exactly the plan is when you have no communication to show for it and no signings to show for it. But I think what Mets fans really need, in order to calm down and to feel a little better about things, is really some major signings. I don't think there will be any stability among the fan base until you see a big splash. And if there's not going to be a big splash, then I think fans deserve some transparency from Cohen and Stearns as to why that's not happening when you know that the resources are there. Whether it's Cody Bellinger, whether it's, Skubal or Kyle Tucker, I think people would be very happy with. I don't think fans are going to be satisfied until they see that lineup and rotation really start to shape up because, like I mentioned earlier, there are just so many more questions than answers right now and so many holes. But if you're the Mets, and if you're thinking about this from a business perspective, if I were the Mets, I wouldn't want to wait until February or late January to kind of have things shape up because at the end of the day, this is a business. I don't know how much this matters to those folks who run the Mets, but you have season ticket holders to satisfy. You have sort of a PR nightmare on your hands this week to kind of simmer down. So I think that if you are the Mets right now, if you are Steve Cohen, if you are David Stearns, the sooner the better in terms of making a big move.
Yeah, I think all Mets fans would agree with that. The sooner the better they can get the bad taste of last week out of their mouth and they can see maybe where the Mets are going to go from here. That will make them feel a lot better, and we'll see how it all plays out. There still is a lot of offseason left to go. But you know what they say sometimes, Ash? Sometimes it gets late early, and Mets fans would like to see, I think you're right, a couple of big name signings, a couple good moves that makes, feel like it's New York, where you have an owner who's got some money in his pockets. I think that would have Mets fans feeling a whole lot better about things. That, everybody, is Ashley Wenskoski. Check her out on the Why Am I a Mets Fan podcast, which is a fantastic name. And I'm sure a lot of you out there have been questioning, why are you a Mets fan at this time after last week? Ashley, always a pleasure having you on Straight Outta Flushing. It was great to talk to you, and hopefully things get better with the Mets.
Thanks so much for having me. I enjoyed talking about it, and I fingers crossed that we have some more to talk about in the coming weeks.
Yeah, we'll have more to talk about in the coming weeks. Again, check out Ashley and her great work with the podcast. I'm Dexter Henry. We'll catch you next time, another edition of Straight Outta Flushing.